This is a video to buttress the argument that academic agent makes in his video, A Positive Vision for the Right. Based on some of the critiques that people made in the comment sections, I feel that they fail to appreciate the importance of social boundaries. And I think part of it comes to some of the false dichotomies presented in the Boomer Truth regime, where the only alternative to a liberal state would be a totalitarian one, right? And that an illiberal state will always be totalitarian and authoritarian. But then we do see how a liberal government can be actually quite totalitarian and can be quite authoritarian, still within the bounds of liberalism. And so to start off, I would like to appeal to an intuition we all have. I think we can all pick out instinctively, or in just our everyday language and interactions with people, that there are basically four social spheres, or there are four social boundaries. And they define the personal, the private, the public, and the universal. And personal things are basically things that would say is between God and I. It usually begins with such statements, right? Private would be tied to, let's say, family, right? People say that this is our family business, your relatives, your close friends, right? And so there's a certain affection and affinity in the private, but in the public, it's more of the larger community, and this is more of obligatory, right? More of like ties of maybe kin or values, like the nationalists. They would say so I think the public will be like the Greek concept of the polis. You don't know each other, maybe you don't even like each other, but you do have a common destiny, and you do have a common obligation to each other to some degree. And there's some things that we can say are universal in the sense of pertaining to all men, right? So we can say like moral obligations and duties. Though some people would want to argue that they're subjective or they're not factual, right? To those who would appeal to some form of fact-value distinction, but then that's a discussion for another time. But then I think you can kind of pick out how these are demarcating. So personal is just I, the private is family, public is community, universal is all men. And in traditional societies, actually, if you study looking at history and looking at how communities would be able to coexist, right, and how they'll maintain harmony and how they'll build trust is by respecting these four social boundaries, right, and that would maybe take the form of taboos, right, or customs. And you find that with these things, when these social boundaries are respected, then this social harmony and social trust grows, and people have a sense of meaning and purpose, like they have a place, they have a direction, there's something they're working towards, they're needed. And if we now start applying to the problem, to apply this view, to try to diagnose the problem that academic agent is trying to solve, you find that the one way of describing the problem is that social boundaries are no longer being respected, right? The liberal order is such that social boundaries end up being dissolved, right? And what happens is that you find that private institutions are invading other spheres of authority. So a private corporation or charity or any such group will mask private interest as a public concern, right? And that will allow them to use the public institutions to accomplish their private interest or their private good. So in essentially is privatization of government masquerading as government in the traditional sense, right? And and I think this is how it ends up manifesting, right? You're raising these boundaries, but also what you're doing is you're sowing confusion and you're deleting trust, because humans have both a visceral, right, and a rational nature. And we are depending on our instincts, we're depending on our intuitions, we're depending on our reasoning, right? We're drawing from tradition, we're drawing from revelation. But then in the public sphere, you find these people now conflicting and equivocating ideas. What Endeavor, I think, described as a society of lies. So for instance, in the book After Virtue by McIntyre, notions of value, right? You find that are usually presented as universal, right? But then people in turn now say that it's personal, right? Morality is subjective, right? I decide, like, yeah, this is my truth, that is your truth. So that one, you notice, is kind of like saying this is a personal matter, but then it's still presented as universal, right? And so, for instance, like, we have an obligation to help the Afghans, or to receive the Afghan refugees or the Syrian refugees. You notice there's a disconnect there, whereby it's being presented as something universal, but at the same time it was being defined as by the same people, being defined as something personal, right? And that is, once you see that discordant, right? Once you see that, people call it hypocrisy, right? And that kills trust, right? What else are they wrong about? Or even like when you take something that belongs to the public and then you start presenting it as if it's universal. So, for instance, citizenship, who can be a citizen in your community, who can belong to your community, or who can take refuge in your community. Shouldn't it be your community, that local community, that decides for themselves, right? Kind of like the 4 freedoms of the EU. So that which the public is supposed to deal with, or the interest of the public is presented as it belongs to everybody, right? So, it belongs to the EU, and anyone in the EU, anyone can come to the EU, and so the 4 freedoms end up becoming another example of erasing the boundaries, right? Making them less clear, making them less distinct. And one example that I was reflecting on is the relationship with sex, right, and social boundaries, and how sexual dysfunction is spread, right, in the modern world. So when you reflect, when you're trying to use your intuition to make sense of where sex can be categorized, the strategy I used was thinking in terms of obligation, right? We cannot say sex is something that falls in the purview of the public, in that you cannot say that my sexual desire, it's up to the public to make sure that my sexual desires are met, right? But at the same time, you can also not say that it's something universal. It's not something that every man can do it, or has that responsibility, or every human has that responsibility. And then also in the same vein, you cannot say it's personal, since that humans are sexually dimorphic, right? And if every human was restricted purely to meeting that need in a personal manner, right? You cannot say that humans will appear in the next generation. So I think it's safe to say that it belongs to the private sphere. And I think the institution of marriage also does demonstrate the intuition that sex is indeed private. But you notice how we erase the boundary of sex being private and the public, or even universal, is that we put it in the market, right? Through pornography and through prostitution. So the commodification of sex serves as erasing of the boundary between the private and the public and the universal, right? Or even the corruption of the Christian ethical principle of judging people, whereby when somebody says only God can judge me, it turns out they're actually saying my public conduct is a private matter, right? So if I'm acting wild, right, I'm going crazy in public, like I was drinking or doing something like that, and somebody asks me about, like, let's say an old woman, right, comes and tells me that, young man, this is not the way you behave in public, and I say only God can judge me, I'm essentially arguing that my public conduct is a private matter. And you see, that's still erasing the boundaries, and that's affecting the social harmony, right? It's sowing confusion, especially with the children who are learning through observation, right? Here, a big chunk of our social education comes from observing people. And you'd also notice that what we're doing also deleting trust, right? You cannot count on each other, because even, how can you count on somebody who doesn't even respect your space, right? Or how can somebody trust you if you don't respect their space, right? And so that also ties in with some intuitions. I think it would also, like, the impact. When I was thinking about the market, and I'm trying to think it in relation to social boundaries. You find that it's a public institution that liberal capitalists treat as if it's a natural law, right? And you find that one of the weird strategies is, especially the multinationals, is commodification of everything, right? Whereby everything is being moved to the public and then presenting that public thing as if it's universal, right? Even when they're supposed to be private. And I think a good example would be our social media pages, where initially you'd find that it was a private thing, whereby it's a network of friends, right? And then it's usually like just friendly interactions. But now it's just so full of advertising, right? And even the people using and people are commodifying it, right? So your social media page also becomes like a avenue by which the corporations will be able to reach your social network. So it's taking something from the public and it's being put in the private sphere, and that's still cutting into the boundary, right? And so you take a commodified thing, and even if it's presented as a right, that's still making it seem universal. So that's my thinking in that third point. This commodified thing sometimes is being presented as a right, that this is your right or something to have through advertising, and presented as something universal, and yet it's not. It's supposed to be either private or personal, right? And what's Trumpton's strategy to deal with all this? You notice that what they think that Trumpton's solution is to formalize roles and responsibilities and maintain them through tradition, right? And those roles and responsibilities, you find that they're aligned to preserving at least three boundaries of the social spheres. Like, it's looking to preserve the personal, the private, and the public, right? Even if you look like the criterion as to who gets to be mayor of Trumpton, right? What kind of things do allow in Trumpton, right? So you find that Trumpton works as a positive vision in that it helps maintain at least three of the social boundaries. It doesn't tackle the boundary of the universal, right? But it's still a pretty good solution when you're thinking of it in terms of social boundaries. And so Trumpton doesn't actually manifest as like totalitarian, or will be anti-technology, or it will hinder progress in some way. What it will do is it will protect the social boundaries and maintain social harmony. And I think we all agree that no human activity or endeavor can succeed without social harmony. And that peace that will be in Trumpton would allow Trumpton to far outlive any other community that doesn't respect these boundaries. And you find the big struggle in Europe, right, and also in the ancient world. What do totalitarians do? They look to erase these boundaries. They look to control things that they have no business controlling. What's the conflict of most people, or the dissidents, right, with the mainstream, or with global homo? They are erasing the boundaries. They are walking into things that they're supposed to walk into, right? They're not respecting the social sphere that they're supposed to be in. And therefore, I think this helps vindicate academic agents' positive vision for the right.